12 consultants had walked away. But a young janitor solved the problem in 1 minute. What the single-dad CEO did next would change everything. Under the cold, sterile lights of the 42nd floor, the bright vision boardroom felt more like a pressure chamber than a place of leadership. It was 11 p.m. The city below blinked with a quiet, detached indifference. But inside, the storm had reached its peak. At 34, Randy Pierce, a single father and the CEO of one of the fastest-growing media tech companies on the East Coast, stood rigid at the head of the long, polished table. His jaw was clenched, and his usually sharp brown eyes were dulled by sheer exhaustion. He looked every bit the man under siege. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie abandoned hours ago, and his voice, typically calm and measured, now trembled with a raw frustration. 12 consultants, some of the most highly paid minds in data infrastructure, had just taken turns outlining the same grim conclusion in different, expensive words. There was no easy fix. Their new platform, launched with tremendous fanfare just days ago, was suffering a catastrophic data sync failure. The user base, hundreds of thousands strong, was experiencing a nightmare of bugs, crashes, and lost information. It's a core architecture failure, one consultant muttered, packing his briefcase. A complete rebuild is your only real path forward. That's 3 weeks minimum. Another added, avoiding Randy's gaze. You might be able to patch it to buy a little time. But the user bleed won't stop. Randy pressed his palms flat against the cool surface of the table, leaning his weight on them. So, we just let it collapse. No one answered. The silence was an accusation. Is that what I'm hearing? He snapped, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Not one of you can fix this. The room remained thick with a heavy, defeated silence. One by one, the consultants gathered their things. Apologies were mumbled, but no one dared to meet Randy's eyes. The last door closed behind them with a soft, final click. He stood alone in the center of the storm he had created, the weight of his company pressing down on his shoulders. Until a voice, soft but firm, broke the silence. Excuse me. Randy turned, startled. A young woman stood by the door in a simple cleaning uniform, a mop bucket resting behind her. Her blonde hair was pulled back loosely, a few stray strands framing a face with wide, determined eyes. Her hands were still damp from her work. I'm sorry, she said, taking a hesitant step into the room. But I think I know where the problem is. Randy blinked, unsure if the exhaustion was making him hallucinate. The janitor, a young blonde woman barely 5 feet tall, stood at the doorway with a quiet, unshakable resolve. The muted hum of the overhead lights was the only sound in the tension-filled room. For a few long seconds, no one moved. All eyes the few remaining. Exhausted tech leads turned toward her, some frowning in disbelief, others simply stunned into silence. Randy took a step forward, his voice a low, calm rumble laced with a desperate curiosity. What did you say? The young woman swallowed, her gaze flickering around the room of seasoned professionals before returning to him. I think. She paused, as if summoning her courage from a deep well. I think I know where the problem is. Murmurs began to ripple through the room like waves hitting glass. One of the junior consultants raised a skeptical eyebrow. A tech lead in the back chuckled under his breath, but stopped abruptly when Randy lifted a hand, silencing the room once more. He nodded at her. Go on. Her name tag, clipped slightly crooked to her faded polo shirt, read Victoria. She walked hesitantly into the room, her work shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. She approached the massive whiteboard slowly, almost reverently, like someone who had dreamed of being in a room like this but never dared to believe it would actually happen. May I? She asked, her hand hovering over a dry erase marker. Randy motioned toward the board. At this point, we're all ears. Victoria uncapped the marker, took a deep breath, and began to draw. Her lines were simple circles, arrows, boxes. There were no complex equations, no confusing acronyms. Just the essence of the issue, stripped bare. She narrated as she worked, her voice soft but steady. Think of it like a file cabinet, she said. But someone accidentally filed a folder in the wrong drawer. When the system tries to find it, it gets redirected to the wrong place over and over again. She drew a looping arrow between two shapes. This is where the cycle begins. The system is trying to sync outdated data, but instead of replacing it with new input, it keeps looping back to the same invalid source. So every time a user logs in or makes a request, boom, it hits the same wall. She added another circle. And because autosync is active across the entire platform, all the subsystems are doing this simultaneously. It's like everyone in the company trying to call the same pizza place at once, all on one landline. That earned a ripple of surprised laughter. It wasn't mocking. It was the kind of laughter that comes from pure relief. The release that follows hours of stress when someone finally puts words to the thing no one else could articulate. Randy stepped closer, folding his arms, his expression unreadable. One of the senior engineers leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the board. She's right, he whispered. That's describing a core loop error, without even using the term. Victoria gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. You don't need to rewrite anything. Just turn off autosync for about 30 minutes. Then, re-index the master link structure and reintroduce the restore commands. But do it in sequence. Not all at once. At the side of the room, a young developer was already typing rapidly, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he ran test commands into the system. The others leaned in, watching the monitors like hawks. No one dared to speak. Seconds stretched into a minute. Then the developer looked up, his eyes wide with astonishment. It's working, he breathed. Data flow is stabilizing. Gasps followed. Then a wave of cheers erupted. Hands slapped backs. One consultant who had lingered stared, open-mouthed. A programmer let out a whoop of pure joy. The tension shattered, and the room came alive again. Not with panic, but with stunned, incredulous celebration. Yet, Randy didn't cheer. He didn't move. He just watched Victoria as though he were seeing her for the very first time. She stood quietly by the whiteboard, marker still in hand, her eyes downcast as if embarrassed by the attention. He walked toward her slowly. And when he spoke, his voice was low and filled with a reverence that silenced the room. "You just saved this company," he said, with nothing but a marker and courage. Victoria finally looked up and offered a small, hesitant smile. Her cheeks tinged with pink. "I don't know if I saved anything. I just remembered something I used to love doing." And in that moment, for the first time all night, Randy felt something more powerful than relief. He felt awe. The next morning, the buzz around Bright Vision's headquarters hadn't faded. Engineers still whispered in hushed tones about the night before how the janitor had solved the data crash that 12 of the industry's best experts could not. But Randy Pierce wasn't interested in gossip. He was staring at the glass wall of his office, watching the reflection of the woman who had single-handedly saved his company. Victoria stood near his door, looking awkward and out of place in her custodial uniform, as if she were unsure whether she was even allowed to enter. Randy gave her a warm nod. "Come in, please." She stepped inside slowly. Her posture was reserved, but her eyes held the same steady fire they'd had at the whiteboard. "I meant what I said last night," Randy began, his voice sincere. "You didn't just help us. You saved us." Victoria offered a faint smile, the kind worn by someone who isn't used to hearing praise. "I just saw a pattern," she said softly. "Something familiar." Randy gestured to the plush chairs opposite his desk. "Sit. I want to understand how someone with your mind ended up pushing a mop in our hallways." She hesitated. Then, as if deciding to let her guard down just a bit, she sat on the edge of the chair. Her voice was calm, but every word seemed like a step through a painful past. "I was a data science major," she began. "Northwell State. I was good at it. Loved it. Actually. But my parents, they didn't." Her story unfolded, painting a picture of quiet heartbreak. "My dad's a surgeon. Mom's a pharmacist. Tech wasn't something they respected, especially for their daughter. They called it a boys' field." Randy raised his eyebrows. "Seriously?" Victoria nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands. "They wanted me to go to med school, be a real professional. When I refused to switch majors, they cut me off. Told me I was on my own if I insisted on wasting my life." Randy leaned forward slightly, but said nothing. He just listened, giving her the space to tell her story. "I tried to make it work," she continued. "I picked up jobs tutoring, waiting tables, anything. But it was never enough. Tuition climbed faster than I could keep up. I had to drop out in my final year." Her hands clenched into small fists on the fabric of her pants. "This janitor job, it came with stable hours and insurance. It let me keep reading, keep learning on my own, even if no one thought I was going anywhere." Randy was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, his voice firm, "Well, they were wrong. And I'd like to offer you something. An official role. Technical consultant. Part-time or full-time. Your choice. No mop. No night shifts." Victoria blinked, startled. You're serious?" "I don't care about degrees," Randy replied, his eyes meeting hers. I care about results and courage. You've got both in spades. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared down at her hands, her silence stretching longer than he expected. Finally, she said softly, I'm grateful. Really. But I need some time to think. Randy was surprised. He had expected an immediate yes. Or at least a flash of excitement. Of course. He said gently. Take all the time you need. But as she stood to leave, he saw something flicker in her face. It wasn't just hesitation. It was fear. That night, Victoria lay awake in her small, rented room, staring at the cracked ceiling. The offer replayed in her mind. A dizzying mix of hope and terror. It wasn't the job she feared. It was everything that came with it. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. No man wants a girl who hides behind computers. That's not how families are built. Another memory surfaced. Her father. Shaking his head in disappointment. You'll end up alone. Broke. And bitter. Tech won't save you. She had fought so hard for so long to drown out those voices. But now, with a real opportunity finally knocking, they were louder than ever. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the moment she stepped into a real job, everyone realized she was a fraud? Her heart pounded in her chest. She was terrified not of failure, but of proving her parents right. And yet, somewhere deep in her chest, the old fire still flickered. The part of her that used to stay up all night devouring coding forums. The part that debugged for fun. The part that dreamed of designing her own algorithms. The dream had never died. She realized. It was just waiting for a chance and for someone to believe. But was she ready to believe in herself? That was the hardest question of all. It was a Saturday afternoon bathed in the soft glow of early spring sunshine. The city park buzzed gently with live children squealing on slides. Couples walking dogs. And elderly folk soaking in the warmth from scattered benches. Randy Pierce, wearing a hoodie and jeans for once, held the small hand of his 4-year-old daughter, Ava, as they strolled the winding paths near the duck pond. Ava wasn't much of a talker around strangers. She had inherited her mother's quiet nature and Randy's intense, observant eyes, often taking in the world with silent contemplation. As they turned a corner, she suddenly tugged on his hand and pointed. "Daddy," she whispered. "That lady has the same book I like." Randy followed her gaze. There, on a bench beneath a budding tree, sat Victoria. Her blonde hair was tied back loosely, strands fluttering in the breeze as she read a weathered paperback. She looked peaceful, completely at home in the sunlight. No mop bucket, no fluorescent lights, just her and a story. Before Randy could react, Ava let go of his hand and, without a shred of hesitation, made her way over to the bench. "Ava. Wait," he called softly. But it was too late. His daughter was already standing beside Victoria, peeking at the book cover. Victoria looked up, startled for a split second. Then her face broke into a warm, genuine smile. "Hi," she said gently. Ava didn't answer with words. She simply climbed up onto the bench beside her, curled her small legs beneath her, and stared at the book. Victoria chuckled softly. Then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped candy. "Would you like one?" she asked. Ava nodded solemnly and took it with both hands, as if it were a precious treasure. Randy watched from a distance, amazed. His daughter rarely warmed up to anyone so quickly. And yet, here she was, nestled beside a woman she barely knew, as if they had been friends forever. After a few minutes, Randy approached. "I hope she's not bothering you," he said. Victoria looked up, her eyes surprised but kind. "Not at all. She's got great taste in books. She really does," he replied with a grin. "I'm impressed. She usually takes weeks to even say hello to someone new." Ava tugged on Victoria's sleeve. "Daddy, can she come eat with us?" Randy raised an eyebrow, a smile playing on his lips. "Well, that's up to her." Victoria hesitated. Her first instinct was to say no, to retreat back into her solitary world. This wasn't her life. She didn't belong in casual dinners with CEOs and their children. But then she looked down at Ava, whose wide, hopeful eyes hadn't yet learned how to judge or dismiss someone. Victoria gave a shy nod. "Okay," she said softly. "Just for a little while." They ended up at a quiet diner on a corner street. A humble place with red vinyl booths and laminated menus. Ava insisted on sitting between the two adults. And the conversation slowly, naturally, unfolded. At first, it was simple things: what Ava liked to read, the ducks in the pond, her absolute dislike of broccoli. But then, something shifted. Randy found himself sharing how he had lost his wife to a sudden illness just after Ava turned 2. How he still struggled with bedtime stories, tiny hair clips, and birthday cakes that felt too quiet. Victoria listened, her eyes soft but unreadable, offering a silent compassion that was more comforting than any words could be. When he asked about her story, she told him about the time she lived in a rented closet behind a laundromat. How she'd worked 3 jobs just to buy second-hand textbooks. How sometimes the hardest part wasn't being poor. It was being invisible. Randy listened not with pity, but with a deep, growing respect. He saw the steel behind her gentleness, the fierce intellect wrapped in humility. She wasn't just surviving. She was still learning, still hoping. And Victoria, for the first time in a long, long time, felt seen not as a janitor or a college dropout, but as a person who had something valuable to offer. They walked out into the cool night air hours later, with Ava holding Victoria's hand all the way to the car. The next morning, Randy was sipping coffee at his kitchen table when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Victoria. It read, "I never thought I'd work at a place like Bright Vision. But I believe in what you said. And I want to try. Thank you for seeing me." Randy smiled. Sometimes, all it took to change a life was a book, a park bench, and a little girl who knew a good storyteller when she saw one. The transition was quiet, but powerful. Victoria showed up on Monday morning. Not with fanfare, but with a second-hand laptop tucked under her arm and her hair tied back in a neat ponytail. Her ID badge now read, Contract Consultant, Tech Support. But to some, she was still just the janitor. Assigned part-time hours with the data analytics team. Victoria was tasked with assisting in logic error detection. The company's platform was a sprawling, complex beast, layered with years of patchwork solutions. It was like entering a house built by a dozen different architects with no common blueprint. But Victoria saw it differently. Where others saw chaos, she saw a structure just waiting to be uncovered. In meetings, while senior staff explained issues with elaborate graphs and a blizzard of acronyms, she would quietly step in afterward and reframe the problem in plain English. It's like trying to send a letter but forgetting the zip code, she once said, pointing to a faulty API routing sequence on a diagram. The system isn't broken. It's just lost. New hires and interns began to gravitate toward her, drawn by her patient demeanor and her ability to explain complex ideas without judgment. One intern, after Victoria helped him troubleshoot a frustrating crash loop, whispered in awe, "You should be the one teaching the training seminars." But not everyone was impressed. Some mid-level managers scoffed behind her back. In break rooms and private Slack channels, the whispers circulated. From mopping floors to data analysis. Must be nice to have the CEO's sympathy. Maybe she's just a pet project. Victoria heard it all. She always had sharp ears. But she said nothing. Instead, she came in early, stayed late, and kept solving the small, tangled problems no one else had the time or patience to untangle. Then came the Wednesday review meeting. It was a monthly presentation where different teams pitched efficiency models. One team, full of ambitious Ivy League grads, launched into a 15-minute spiel so thick with jargon and convoluted flowcharts that by the halfway mark, eyes around the room had glazed over. A junior manager let out an audible yawn. Randy sat with a polite, fixed smile. But even he was losing the thread. Then, Victoria stood up. She walked calmly to the whiteboard, uncapped a marker, and drew a single, simple box in the center. "This is your user," she said, her voice clear and steady. Around it, she drew a few circles. "Here's the login process, the purchase loop, the recommendation engine." But right now, she tapped the board firmly. "They're all optimized in isolation. Not for the person in the middle." A hush fell over the room. No buzzwords. No complex graphs. Just stunning clarity. She drew new arrows connecting the circles, redrawing the entire platform as a seamless flow that began and ended with the user's experience. Not just back-end logic. When she finished, no one moved. Then someone started clapping. Then another. And soon the entire room erupted in spontaneous, genuine applause. Randy, standing in the back, didn't clap immediately. He just looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. It wasn't just admiration he felt. It was something deeper, respect, and a profound sense of recognition. When the meeting ended, Randy approached her near the coffee machine. "You didn't just explain the problem," he said quietly. "You made them care." Victoria looked up. A little shy. A little amused. "I just wanted them to understand." He nodded slowly. "That's exactly what this place has needed." That night, Victoria stayed late, as she often did. The office was quieter then, and she worked best in the silence. But something was different now. She no longer felt like a guest. She belonged. Not because she had a title, but because she had earned their trust, the kind no resume could ever buy. And in a company full of talkers, she had proven that the quietest voice could still command the room. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, just 3 days before the company's long-anticipated new product launch. Victoria had been entrusted with the final quality assurance sweep, a meticulous data integrity check before the new feature went live. She had flagged a potential conflict in the autosync protocol the night before, submitting a detailed, clear report to the project leads. But in the rush to launch, no one had followed up. And now, during the live demonstration in front of investors and media partners, the system froze. Not once, but twice. A cold dread filled the room. Immediately, a hostile murmur rose among the managers. Fingers began to point quietly at first, then more directly. It was her module, right? She's only been here a few weeks. What did you expect? I said it from the beginning. This is what happens when you hire someone without formal training. Victoria stood at the side of the room, feeling as if she were encased in ice. The screens around her blinked with red error messages. She could hear every word, every doubt, and her breath caught in her throat. It felt exactly like the day her mother told her she was wasting her life. The day her old professor said, "You simply don't have the background to succeed in this field." The ghosts of her past were all echoing back at once. A senior project manager approached Randy later that evening in his office. "We should reconsider her role," he said gravely. "She's talented, but she's a risk." Randy did not reply, his face an unreadable mask. That night, Victoria packed the few personal items from her desk in a small box. She left her ID badge on the clean surface. There was no resignation letter, just the quiet, defeated folding of someone who had learned too many times that belonging often came with an expiration date. But as she reached the elevator, her hand hovering over the button, a small voice called out from behind her. "Miss Victoria." It was Ava, Randy's daughter, standing in her pajamas and clutching a piece of paper. "I made this for you." The picture was simple, 2 stick figures standing under a bright, colorful rainbow. In bold crayon letters, it read, "Miss Victoria is my hero." Victoria knelt, her eyes misting over. She took the drawing in trembling hands and pressed it to her chest, the simple paper feeling like an anchor. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ava simply smiled and wrapped her small arms around her neck in a tight hug. Victoria did not leave. The next morning, she walked into the post-mortem meeting room, her badge reattached and her head held high. She waited until the room was full and the accusations began to fly. Then, with quiet conviction, she stood, opened her laptop, and displayed the report she had sent days earlier. "I flagged this error before the test," she began, her voice steady and clear. Page 3. Section 2. It outlines exactly where the failure point would occur if the autosync protocol was not decoupled from the new feature. She clicked to the next slide. The data was all there, clear, time-stamped, and verified. Silence. Then, uncomfortable murmurs. Randy stood up. He turned, not to Victoria, but to the table of managers. His voice was calm but carried the weight of steel. "Next time, he said, his gaze sweeping over them. Listen to the people who actually know what they're doing. No anger. No raised voice. Just undeniable truth. Victoria felt her chest swell with something she had rarely allowed herself to feel in rooms like this: validation. Not the kind you begged for, but the kind you earned and finally received. And for the first time, someone in a position of power did not ask her to explain or defend herself. He simply stood by her side. The days that followed were quieter. At least on the surface. The storm of the failed launch had passed, leaving behind the calm routine of post-release tweaks and stability checks. But underneath that predictable rhythm, something new and fragile was beginning to grow. Victoria and Ava became nearly inseparable after hours. What began as a single walk to the ice cream truck turned into a series of small, sacred rituals. A shared cup of hot chocolate on a chilly afternoon. A story read aloud beneath the great elm tree in the company's garden. By the end of the third week, it had become a rhythm of its own, unspoken, cherished, and quietly healing for them all. Want to hear a story about a girl who built her own robot? Victoria would whisper as they sat cross-legged on a plaid picnic blanket. Ava's eyes would always widen with excitement. Yes. But only if she names it Waffles. Victoria would chuckle, tapping the girl's nose. Deal. Robot Waffles it is. They had their own world now. One stitched together by laughter and gentle questions. It was during one of those sun-drenched afternoons, as they shared a cup of melting strawberry swirl ice cream, that Ava looked up with curious eyes and asked, "Miss Victoria, how come your house doesn't have anyone like Daddy and me?" The question was innocent, filled with pure, childlike wonder. Victoria's spoon paused midway to her lips. She glanced at Ava, then out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "I used to have a family," Victoria finally said, her voice low and steady. "But they didn't believe I could do big things. So I left. Or maybe," she added softly, "they left me. In their own way." Ava blinked slowly, processed this, and then leaned her head against Victoria's arm without saying a word. Her small, simple gesture of comfort said everything. Unbeknownst to them, Randy had been watching from a few steps away. He had come to bring Ava her water bottle but had paused when he overheard the exchange. Something inside him pulled tight, not out of pity, but out of a profound sense of recognition. He, too, had known loss and disapproval. And standing there, he saw a beautiful, resilient bridge forming between his daughter and this quietly extraordinary woman. That evening, as the city began to glow in amber hues, Randy walked Victoria to the subway stop. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly nervous. Victoria glanced at him, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "You mean, to talk about the database scaling issues?" He laughed. A warm, disarming sound. "No. I mean dinner. No shop talk. Just two people. Maybe three. If we let our tiny chaperone join us." That night, seated at a modest bistro tucked between two old bookstores, they shared a meal that had little to do with food and everything to do with opening doors they both thought had been sealed shut long ago. They didn't discuss analytics or user interfaces. Instead, they spoke of the fears and hopes rarely spoken aloud. Randy confessed his fear of raising Ava alone. Of constantly feeling like he was failing at being both a father and a CEO. Victoria shared her own truths about sleeping in a storage unit. About her fingers blistered from mopping but her mind hungry to learn. She told it not as a tragedy, but as a path she had walked with grit and determination. Somewhere between a second glass of chamomile tea and a shared, lingering laugh, Randy reached across the table and took her hand. It wasn't the gesture of a boss or a benefactor, but of a man who saw something truly precious in a woman who had learned to carry her own light. Victoria looked down at their joined hands, then back at him. In his eyes, she saw no expectations, no pity, just peace. And in her touch, Randy felt something he hadn't known in years. He felt hope. 6 months later, the atmosphere at Bright Vision had subtly but unmistakably transformed. The sterile intensity that once hung over the office had softened into something warmer, more collaborative. Laughter was more common. Engineers volunteered to mentor interns. And whenever a complex problem arose, it became common to hear someone say, "Hey, let's run this by Victoria. She has a way of making things clearer." Victoria Blake, who once mopped the very floors she now walked with calm authority, sat at the head of a long table in the main strategy room. Her nameplate now read, Team Lead, Data Intelligence. Yet her desk told a different story. It held a thrift store ceramic mug with a chipped rim and was covered in whimsical doodles from Ava of stick figure robots and happy sons. She still wore her comfortable sneakers and her favorite cardigan with frayed cuffs. It was never what she wore. It was the weight her words now carried. Then came Friday. The company's massive conference room was filled wall to wall. The lights dimmed as Randy Pierce stood at the front, calm and confident. "I want to talk today about vision," he began. "Not the product name. Not our quarterly reports. I mean the kind of vision that sees potential before the rest of the world catches up." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. There are people in this world who have always had the keys, who have always been allowed to speak first. And then there are those who have had to fight just to be noticed. People who were told they don't belong, that they're too underqualified, too ordinary. A hush fell over the room. "I am proud to announce Bright Vision's newest division," he continued, his voice ringing with passion. "A training and development branch focused on identifying and nurturing the kind of talent that doesn't come with polished resumes. A place where people can rise. Not because of where they started, but because of what they're capable of." Behind him, the projector screen lit up with the initiative's name. And underneath it, the director's title, Bright Future Initiative, Director, Victoria Blake. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly silent. Then, like a ripple breaking into a wave, applause erupted loud, sincere, and sustained. Every single person in the room rose to their feet. Victoria stood slowly, visibly moved, placing a hand over her heart. Her gaze swept across the crowd: engineers, receptionists, the cleaning crew, interns. Many were smiling. Some had tears in their eyes. She nodded once, her own eyes shining, and sat back down. Later that evening, the building was quiet. Victoria lingered in her new office, a floor higher than the one she once mopped at midnight. The city lights stretched out before her, dazzling and endless. Once, they had felt unreachable. Tonight, They glimmered like old friends. The door opened with a quiet creak. Randy stepped in. His tie loosened. "Big day," he said with a warm smile. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "I never thought any of this would be real." He walked closer, laying a hand gently on her shoulder. "It is real. And you made it so." She turned to face him, her eyes full of emotion. "You believed in me when I couldn't even see myself." He shook his head softly. "I didn't believe. I saw." "That's different." Just then, the sound of light footsteps came bounding down the hallway. "Miss Victoria." Ava's voice rang out as she darted into the room, her backpack bouncing behind her. "You're still here." Victoria knelt and opened her arms. "Of course I am." Ava beamed, thrusting a small container into her hands. "I brought cookies. Daddy says it's your big people day." They all laughed, the sound echoing warmly in the quiet office. Randy offered Victoria his arm. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. Victoria glanced from his face to Ava's small hand, which was now wrapped tightly around her own. Then she smiled. A radiant, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. She nodded. They walked out of the building together, leaving the towering skyscraper behind. Not as CEO and team lead, but as something more. Something whole. As a family. If this story stirred something deep within you, if it reminded you that courage often comes in the quietest moments and that the most overlooked people can carry the brightest light, then you are not alone. Victoria's journey from unseen to unstoppable shows us that no dream is ever truly lost. All it takes is one person to believe, one moment of courage, and 1 second of being truly seen. If you believe in the power of stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of the incredible potential within humanity, then we invite you to join our growing community. Subscribe to soul-stirring stories and never miss a tale that touches the heart and uplifts the soul. Because sometimes, the right story at the right time can change everything.